it's Latifa with Latifa Sapphire Studios. Thanks so much for joining me today. Today I get to talk to you about and teach you how to put on a chunky binding. It's actually a little bit more than just a chunky binding. It's actually making the decision on what size binding you're going to put on your quilt. And then I'll give you a really easy formula for you to figure out how wide to cut those binding strips. And then from there, we'll go to the machine and I'll show you how to stitch that binding down. This particular technique is going to work no matter how you finish your binding. So if you stitch it to the back, flip it to the front, and then machine stitch it down, that's what we're going to do today, then it works. If you stitch it to the back, flip it to the front, and then hand stitch it down, maybe with a big stitch, just like a big stitch with visible stitches, then it works for that as well. Or if you prefer to stitch it to the front, flip it to the back, and then either hand or machine finish it, then it works for that as well. So I'm really kind of excited about doing this. I tried to shoot this video with a finished quilt, and everything that wanted to go wrong went wrong. So I set that project aside. I grabbed this really pretty Melody Miller, just a piece of fabric. I quilted it up with a diagonal cross hatch, something really simple with some Carolyn Friedlander on the back. And I grabbed a really fun contrast in a pink Kona. I'm actually not sure the shade this is for our Kona, but you know, there's a ton of shades of Kona cotton. So I'm kind of excited to put that together. It's a little bit less stress than working on a real quilt, but you'll get to learn the technique all the same. One thing I want to encourage you as you watch this video and after the video, when you start to work with your real quilt projects, is to start to think about binding as a design choice. I think about my binding when I'm pulling my fabric, when I'm deciding on a pattern. I think about what is going to really frame that quilt well, because your binding is this really key visual element in your quilt. It's kind of like the icing on the cake. It's the finishing touch that we put on our quilts. And it's not fair to our quilts to put on the same kind of binding over and over and over again, kind of by default, when there's so many options for putting on binding in the world. My favorite is a 1-inch binding, so that's what I'm going to show you today. You can see it on the quilt behind me. This is another Callaloo quilt that I just happen to have laying around, and you can see that big chunky 1-inch binding all the way around. See how great it frames it, right? It looks really, really fabulous, and it really pulls out the other elements in the quilt. But you can put, like I said, pick any size. So you could put on a 1/2-inch binding or 3/4 inch binding or 1.5 inch binding. I think the biggest I've played with so far is 2 inches, which is huge and sort of ridiculous, but look who we're talking about here. So, but I'm gonna demo on a 1-inch. We're gonna head over to the cutting table, and I'm gonna start to show you all the things so that you can take this technique and use it on your own quilts. Let's head to the cutting table. Factors. Okay, so the formula for calculating how wide to cut those strips is this. It's 4 times however wide you're finished with if your binding needs to be, plus 3/4 inch. So if I want 1 inch finished with binding, 4 times 1 equals 4, plus 3/4 inch. So 4 3/4 inch is the width of the strip that I cut out. The same thing if I want, say, a 3/4 inch binding. 3/4 inch, we know that equals 0.75. We type that in our calculator. 0.75 times 4 equals 3, plus 3/4 inch. So 3 3/4 inch is how wide we would cut that. And that works for any size. Now I'm going to give you, that's your basic formula. Sometimes you may have to cut out a little piece of a strip, press it, and maybe stitch it with a basting stitch to your quilt, flip it and make sure it's right. Quilts, our fabric is such a, there's lots of inconsistencies in fabric. There's lots of different lofts in your batting. There's so many different variables. So because of that, if you're going to do something like machine stitch the final stitch of your binding now, like we're going to do today, oftentimes I'm going to add like 1/4 inch to that measurement. So I've already tested mine, and I'm actually going to add 1/4 inch because I know I want to machine stitch it down, and I want that machine stitching to fall in my backing, which I'll show you at my at the sewing machine. So I'm going to cut these strips 5 inches wide. So 4 times 1 inch finished width plus 3/4 of an inch would be 4 3/4. And just to give ourselves a little bit of wiggle room, I'm going to add another 1/4 inch and cut these strips 5 inches. Okay, so if I want to cut this on the bias, which I do because I like a bias strip. A lot of people think that bias is more difficult. It really isn't. This is probably about, let's see, 2/3 of a yard of fabric or a little bit more. And the first thing you want to do is fold a selvage side to a cut side. And I do not trim my selvages at this point until after my strips are sewn together. So I don't know if you can see that or not, but that's actually a selvage there, and then that's a cut side. So I fold one up to another, and it's going to give you sort of this triangular sort of a shape here and these weird angles. Okay, that's how I started off. Now this is way too wide for my cutting mat, so I'm going to fold along that bias fold. Okay, so I'm just going to fold along that fold so that I can go ahead and start to cut my strips. And first thing that we do is we grab our long ruler, and we're just going to trim a nice clean edge. Let me scoot that over so you can see it. A nice clean edge on the side. We're basically cutting that fold off there. All the way across. And now I'm just going to come back and cut 5-inch strips for this particular project. Just like that. Now we don't worry about selvage, we don't worry about angles on the ends of our fabric. We're just going to cut those 5-inch strips across. Now if I were cutting straight of grain strips, I would just use the fabric that was already off of the boat and just cut a couple of 5-inch strips across the width of that. Now, if you have something like a Stripology ruler or one of the June Taylor Shape Cut Plus rulers or something like that, then it's not a bad thing to use when cutting your strips out. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take all of our strips over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to show you how to join your strips at the sewing machine. And we're basically just going to take this whole pile of strips that we just cut up, and we're going to join them together to make one long piece of binding. I'm going to show you how I do that at the sewing machine. Let's head over there now. Okay, so now I'm at my sewing machine, and it's time to join our strips. So I literally will bring my pile of strips to my machine just like that. Not a lot of fanfare. I do want to remind you that we just cut those strips out. We don't care that we have selvages. We don't care what angles, or even that this is a straight cut at one end, or if one angle's in one direction and one angle's in another direction. I'm going to show you how we work around all of that, and we trim it off pretty quickly after that. So I have my machine set with my needle in the center needle position, and I have my A-foot on. You can also use like an open toe foot or something. I do like the Janome A-foot, which is sort of a standard foot, because they have this little red dot right in the middle. I don't know if you can see that or not. And it's like a little red arrow, and it shows you where the center or center needle position is. So it's actually pretty convenient. I do like to have the A-foot on when I'm doing this. And the way that we do this without measuring or marking is we grab our trusty blue tape. So I love all of the things that we can buy from the hardware store for our sewing room, and blue tape is one. So now I'm just going to tear off a generous piece. I'm going to place this with the right edge of that tape aligned with our needle position on the bed of our machine, just like that. All the way down. Okay, so in this particular when I'm joining these strips, especially the really big ones, I like to have either an extension table on my machine. If you have one, it's nice to put on. Or in this case, I have my machine inside of a table, which is really a really nice convenience to have. And then I'm going to actually move my big pile of strips. I'm just going to grab the first two, and then we're going to talk through how we start to sew those together. And the tape, thankfully, is what we use to line everything up. So the first strip I put on, first I placed them at a 90-degree angle. So the first strip, we're looking at the pretty side of our fabric. So of course I selected a Kona cotton, so you can't tell the right and wrong sides. But we're looking at the pretty side, the right side of our fabric on the first strip, and then we place them right sides together. So the second strip would be we would be looking at the wrong side of our fabric. Now, and we want like a nice 90-degree angle here at the bottom. If you choose to, and I'll show you in a minute when we'll do that, you can put a pin or two in just to hold it in place. I don't usually do this. Now, these angles happen to be going in the right direction. A lot of times they will not. So let's say, since this is a Kona, if this were the right side of the fabric, we would place these right sides together. I'll show you the two things that we look at to make sure that once we stitch this together, that it's going to flip open and we're going to have one continuous strip. And we stitch from upper left to lower right every single time, upper left to lower right. Now, the upper space here, we should have a little bit of a sort of a backwards L here and a backwards upside down L here at the bottom as well. Those are the two things that we look at. We don't care about any of these angles or sides or whatever. So if you have to shift that fabric to make sure you have that little L there and at least one on the opposite side, then you know once you stitch it together and flip it open, it's going to be in the right placement. So, and I just make sure it's kind of a 90-degree angle there. I don't get super caught up on it. You can eyeball it and get it pretty good. If I'm going to put a pin or two in, I just put one here and here just to hold it in place. I'm going to pull those out before I start to sew. Now, the way that I line it up nicely is I put my needle down. Now, I have the machine set, center needle position, just a standard foot on and standard stitch length, which on the Janome is about a 2.4. I think that equals about 10 or 11 stitches per inch. So put our needle in the down position. We snuggle that upper left V right up against the needle. The opposite end, let me zoom this out just a little bit so you can see the opposite end pretty easily. The opposite end, we're going to line up with the edge of that tape that we placed. That way we know that we're sewing it in a straight line. So a few stitches. I'm going to take that pin out so that we don't have to run over it. And I don't look at my needle. I look at making sure that V, that sort of upside down V here now, the point of it is lined up with that piece of tape. So we're just going to sew. Now, and of course, I'm using a lot of language here and talking you through it, but I can throw these on my machine and sew them pretty quickly. So we take that off our machine, we open it up, and we have a continuous strip. And we keep adding to that, so make sure it's still right side up. We grab our next strip, we place that right sides together. And see, these both have selvages on them, so we just want to make sure we're sewing past the selvages. So 90-degree here, we want to upper left, lower right. Needle down, snuggle the V, put our foot down right on that V, align this edge, and so. Upper left, lower right is the way you sew. Now, if something happens and you start to lay things on your machine and you are not sure if once you sew it together it's going to stitch in the right direction, what do? I usually, if I have a small ruler by my machine, in this case I'm just going to grab my scissors, sort of lay them on the place that I think I'm going to sew and flip it up. And if it's a continuous line, then I know that it will stitch correctly. Upper left, lower right, put our needle down, rotate it, snuggle the V right on a needle so we know it's going to start right in the correct spot. And so I'm lining this edge up with the tape. That's where my eye is, right there. And we do this all the way to the end. Okay, now we have our strip completely sewn together. Now we have to trim these ends. Now I do this either, a lot of times I grab my big pair of scissors and my big, I think that's the 8-inch Kai scissors, but I grab my Kais at my machine and I trim them at my machine. If I have a cutting mat set up in my rotary cutter, I will do it with my rotary cutter. One thing I do not do is measure this as I trim it. So I'm going to show you the way that I cut this so that when we press it, we won't have dog ears no matter how we press. So that's our strip right there. That's our seam along that diagonal. We're going to cut up, across about 1/4 of an inch from a diagonal. This does not require getting a tape measure out. And then across the top, just like that. So I'm going to try to let you look at that a little bit closer. We cut up, across, and across. So along the edge of this piece of fabric and that piece of fabric, and then along the diagonal an approximate 1/4 inch. When we open it up, it's a nice continuous strip. And the nice thing about this, and this is how I trim when I'm doing binding strip or bias tape strips, even when I do bias tape applique and that type of thing, no matter if we press to the right or the left or press it open, then we're not going to have dog ears. So okay, now we have our strips sewn together. Now we're going to finish prepping our binding, and that's basically pressing our seams and also then folding our binding in half and pressing it. So this step is pretty easy. I'm going to have my nice little Oliso mini iron here, which is nice because it also has steam. Now the way that I showed you how to cut those seams, we can either press it open, which I do like to do on my bindings, or you can press it to one side and it doesn't matter which side you press it to, and you should not have any dog ears, which is really nice. I'm going to fold this in half. Uh-oh, picked up some strings there. We're just going to fold this in half, matching the edges, and then create a nice sharp crease on the side of our quilt here. I mean our binding strip here. Okay. Just folding it in half, matching the two edges, and press it. Go all the way. Okay, I wanted to talk through this step just a little bit because, and that's the squaring your quilt up step. The reason why is because with the chunky binding, you want to be a little bit concerned about quilt designs that could come all the way close to the edge of your quilt. So a lot of your quilt blocks are you're going to have key elements of those blocks that are going to literally be 1/4 inch from the edge of your quilt top. And of course this is kind of a whole cloth, just a piece of fabric that's quilted, so I can demo putting on the chunky binding. If you in fact have some quilt elements that literally go to 1/4 inch within the edge of your quilt top, then you may want to actually extend your squaring up into the batting and backing. So you do want to make sure there's backing on the back that extends all the way to the edge that you cut. I would handle that if I had design elements. The other thing that you can do that will help prevent you not having to do this is to actually add a skinny or maybe even a larger border all the way around your quilt top. A lot of times I don't want to do that. So let me show you really quick. I'm going to grab that Callaloo quilt one more time. And you're going to see, and one of the reasons why, especially with my Glam Clam quilts, why I have those really big peripheral shapes is because I don't want that binding to chop off the side of my clamshells. I want my binding sort of to kiss the edge of those clamshells all the way around. So I built that buffer actually into the shapes so that I can accommodate that chunky binding, which you all know that I love. So that's just sort of an example. If, for instance, I didn't have that built into these sort of peripheral shapes, I would do the same thing I'm telling you here. If it's an inch binding that I'm putting on, subtract 1/4 of an inch and then lay that 3/4 inch line on the outside edge of your quilt top, and you're going to include that binding. You need that 1/4 inch in order to be able to stitch your binding on and actually capture the front of your quilt. So just a little bitty quick tip. Because it's not necessary for this particular little guy here, I'm just going to take a quick minute and I'm going to square it up just normally along the edge of that project, and then we're going to head to the sewing machine and stitch all of this down. I'll see you over at the machine. Now we are ready to stitch our binding down. At least we're going to stitch it to the back side, and then we're going to flip it and then stitch it to the front. So we're going to stitch the first side down. But let's make a few changes to our machine first. The first change that we're going to do is to pull the tape up that we use to join our strips and toss that. And then the second thing we're going to do is take that regular foot off. And if you at all have it, I want you to find your 1/4 inch foot with a flange and put that on your machine. I find that the 1/4 inch foot with the flange is the perfect foot for this because you do not have to think about lining up the binding, which is what we're going to use this foot for, with the edge of a regular foot. If you don't have it, then set your machine up the way you normally would for 1/4 inch seam allowance and then use that. But this is definitely ideal. This particular machine, I'm moving my needle all the way over so that I can use that 1/4 inch foot in setting. So the second thing we're going to do, we're going to use more tape. And I'm going to pull off, actually we're going to put 2 pieces of tape on now. And then you can use, if you know the distance from your needle, let's just put our needle down really quick. And then we're just going to measure 1 inch from the needle position to the right. And just put a piece of tape on the bed of our machine. And I'm using the left, I moved my ruler just a little bit. I'm using the left edge of that tape, and I see where it lines up. So I'm going to go ahead and move that and put the tape down, just like that. Okay, so that's 1 inch from the needle. So put your 1/4 inch foot on, set your needle to the correct place for your 1/4 inch settings, whatever that is for your machine. And then measure 1 inch from the needle, put a piece of tape down, grab a second sort of shorter piece of tape, and then we're going to measure 1 inch from the needle in that direction. And I don't always do this step, but it is a nice step to do because you don't have to guess when you're 1 inch away from the edge of your quilt and when you're supposed to stop. So that's not a bad one to do. So 1 inch from your needle to the right and 1 inch from your needle in the front is where you put the blue tape. Okay, we are ready to sew. So I generally start stitching my binding like at the bottom. This quilt doesn't have an obvious side to it, so I'm just going to start on one of the sides. You want to leave at least a 12-inch opening, but even a larger opening is better than that. So I'm going to leave an extra long tail and start relatively close to the end. So what I'm doing is I'm placing my binding under my 1/4 inch foot, line the binding up with the edge of the 1/4 inch foot, and line the edge of the quilt up with the left edge of that blue tape. And what that's going to do is stitch our binding down with a 1/4 inch seam 1 inch from the edge. So then when we flip it over, we'll have 1 inch of bias tape. And you know what? I'm not setting this up correctly. There you go. Always, what did they say? Measure twice and cut once. Well, look at it twice and then sew after that. Because we are going to stitch to the back and then flip it to the front. And I'll show you why I do that and why I like it. And when I'm doing a machine stitch. Same setup, the edge of the quilt on the blue tape. So this is also it's a good time to show, this is the folded edge here, and the edge that I'm putting against that 1/4 inch foot is the raw edge of the fabric where it has the 2 layers. Okay. Now I think we're at the right place, and now we can sew. Okay, so I have a 1/4 inch seam. I do like to put a little lock stitch when I start off on that binding, and also when I end, before I do my join. It's not 100% necessary, or you can do a little back stitch if your machine has that. So a little lock stitch, then I'm kind of lining this up here, then I'm going to sew. And I take my time with it because I want it to stay nice and lined up. So you take your time and make adjustments as you're stitching this along. Now, that 1/4 inch foot, if I don't use it, then I find that this method isn't nearly as accurate. So if you have it, take the time to pull it out. Now we're going to stop sewing when the front edge of this quilt, or the bottom edge, I guess, with this perspective, no matter which side that you're on, aligns with the top edge of the tape that's going in the horizontal direction. So you'll see when I stop. So I slow down as I'm getting to this end, and that's about right there. Let's do one more stitch. Okay, maybe a little bit too far. And then you can do a lock stitch here, or you can just cut your thread, because we're actually going to stitch over that when we come back in the opposite direction. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to miter that corner to have really nice, pretty mitered corners. So now we stopped sewing 1 inch from the end of that quilt sandwich, and we're going to fold it back at a 45-degree angle, just like that. So that biased, well, I'm saying bias tape, it could be straight of grain. Your binding tape should extend in that direction for now. Then we're going to fold it back in this direction, right at the edge of the quilt, just like that. Now this is where you can throw a straight pin in if that is helpful to you, just to hold it in place while we rotate it. Now when we rotate it, we're going to do a couple of checks just to make sure that everything is lined up properly, and we may have to shift it just a little bit. Now it looks like that bias tape isn't, let me take this pin out, that bias tape isn't quite coming over to our 1/4 inch foot when we line the edge of the quilt up with our tape here. So let's fold it one more time. We're just going to fold it not quite as far back, and then come down once again, and then let's line it up. Get everything nice and straight under there. Just like that. When we start to sew this, we're actually going to start to sew all the way from the edge of the quilt. So start slowly, make sure everything is lined up nicely, and we should have a really nice mitered corner there. Perfect. So I just measured, lay it out, you know, maybe 6 inches at a time. Now I'm eyeballing this. I've known someone who actually came in and marked 3/4 inches from the edge of your quilt. That's a little bit much to me. If I needed to do that, then I would actually just grab a ruler at my machine like that. If you know me, I don't actually do that either. Once I get a pretty good idea for how that looks visually, that 3/4 inches from the edge, which is what that measures out to be, then, and what I'm looking at is I'm constantly keeping the edge of the quilt along the tape here and making sure that the bias tape is butted up right up against the foot there. Now, if you get off just a little bit like I just did, I'm just going to cut, rip just a few stitches, just like that. Put it back on my machine, back where I know I was in the right place. Line it up. Make sure my binding tape is nice and straight, and stitch right back over it. It's pretty easy to get right back on track with that. Okay, so we are at our last mitered corner here. We're going to fold that back with a 45-degree angle. The other way that you can do this, if you're having problems turning that corner, is when you fold it back to make sure this edge here, so this bottom edge here, is 3/4 of an inch from the edge. Now, I'm saying 3/4 inch because we're putting on a 1-inch finish with binding. So it's whatever your measurement, your binding measurement is, minus 1/4 inch. If you're doing 3/4 inch white binding, then you would subtract 1/4 inch. It would be 1/2 inch from the end. So, but in this case, for 1 inch with binding, and we make our adjustments here before we fold the binding back in that direction, just like that. Now, when we rotate it to start to stitch that last side down, it should fit perfectly, and it does. So we start sewing right from the end. Now, I want to give myself quite a bit of room to be able to join. So I'm only going to stitch here maybe 3 or 4 inches. And then I'm going to lock my stitch and take it off my machine so that I can show you how I do a join, okay? I guess that's enough. We'll lock our stitch, cut our thread, and take it off of our machine. Okay, now we have these two pretty generous ends. And the first thing I do, so I gave myself, it looks like it's about maybe 14 inches between those 2 points, okay? Give yourself as much room as you can, because it really helps when you start to, you'll see we have to really kind of manipulate the fabric to make it work. So I lay the left side down and maybe about 8 inches in. I'm going to take a pair of scissors. I do all this at my machine, so, and I'm just going to cut the binding. So I have about an 8-inch tail here now. Okay, now I lay that down nice and flat, and I lay the other tail from the opposite end right on top of it. Now, how do I know how much to cut this piece on top? That piece that we just cut off, and if you don't have a long enough piece, so we have an extra long piece here, we could have cut a piece off here as well. The width of your binding strip is how much that you should overlap those two pieces, right? So a lot of times I'm just laying it on top where I can see the bottom piece, which we've already trimmed, and now we're going to, from that edge, we're going to cut the top piece of binding tape the same amount of overlap as the width of our binding strip. So just like that. So if we look at it, I'm going to spread it a little bit here. It's kind of hard to see when it's overlapped, but the overlap is the width of the binding. Okay, so that's how we cut that. Now the next step is we're going to do that diagonal join again. So I like to go ahead, and we don't need this tape really too much anymore. We definitely don't need that piece. This piece here, we can leave that on the machine. But I am going to grab a last piece of tape And because when we do this joint, we're really going to be manipulating a lot. I'm going to throw my A-foot back on, put it back in the center needle position, just to make that joint easy for us. I've done it before where I left my 1/4 inch foot on and tried to work with it because I was being lazy. It really doesn't work as well. So take the few extra seconds to set it up so that you make everything easier for yourself. So once again, the right edge of that tape is in line with our needle, just like when we joined our strips earlier. Now, this is where I wish I had selected a print fabric where you can see the wrong and right side. So it'll be a little bit more difficult for you to see these strips here because our lovely Kona is the same pretty much on the right and wrong sides. So this is a part where it can get confused and turned around and turned upside down and actually get things sort of messed up just a little bit. But we want to do a diagonal join just like we did on all the rest of our binding strips here. So I'm going to show you an easy way to do that. Okay, so we're going to open up the bottom piece, so the piece coming off of the left side, so we can see the pretty side of that fabric. This is where I think I should have used the fabric that has 2 sides to it instead of a Kona. But we're looking at the pretty side. We'd open up the right side as well, so we're seeing the pretty side as well. So they're both in the right direction. Now we're going to sew these two together at a diagonal. So this is my little trick here to make sure they're both turned in the right direction. The top piece, I lift it up. This bottom left corner, I'm going to fold it up so that it touches the right side. Then I'm going to place it on top of the left strip. Then I can open it up and pin it together. Now remember, we're going to do that diagonal join, so we want a little bit of an overlap here at the top with that upper left V, just like that. I'm going to put a pin through it. I'm going to put that pin in a diagonal so that I can fold it back and double check it again. And then manipulating that quilt, you always have to manipulate a lot at this time, especially if you're working on a smaller project and you just don't have a lot of room to have that overlap. And I'm going to put another pin. So upper left, lower right, we're still piecing it the same way that we did our joins, just like that. Now we can double check that it's going to, if we pin it in those 2 places, we can double check that. Let's put 1 pin in the middle too, because this is a pretty big, well, not really the middle, but kind of halfway through. Okay, so if we open that up, we can make sure that it's going to piece in the right direction. You see how that works? Okay, so do you want me to go over that again? Let's go over that one more time, how I did that. You could also rewind this when you get to this stage. So the left piece is folded still. That goes on the bottom. The right piece on the top. The overlap is the same width as your binding, so you use your little bit of extra binding strip to double check that. Okay, we open the bottom piece, pretty side up. We open the top piece, also pretty side up. Now on the top piece, which is the right side, we look at the bottom left corner, we just fold it up so that this edge matches the top. Just like that. And what we're doing is we're folding that at a 45-degree angle, just like that. Now we're going to place that on top of the left strip. And that just lines it up perfectly. But we have to flip it open and pin it in place so that we can sew along that diagonal. We overlap just the teensiest bit, so we have a little bitty tiny V up at the top, upper left, lower right, remember? And then the same thing, we make sure it's overlapped just the teensiest bit. We may have to scoot the one at the top over. Just the teensiest bit, so we have that little V at the lower left as well. Just putting some pins through it to make sure that it sort of all stays in place, because it's really a tight corner. It always is. So it's always, you just take your time with this step and your join. Now I'm going to move all of the quilt top out of the way. I'm going to manipulate everything so I have my binding strips that are going to fit right under my machine. just like that. I put my needle in the down position. I snuggle the upper left V right up against the needle, just like we join our binding strips. Now I normally will take just a stitch or two just to make sure it's going to hold that end. Now I'm going to manipulate my quilt and my binding, make sure everything is nice and flat in front of my needle. Uh-oh. So right now, this will be all kind of a big jumbo bunch or whatever. I want to make sure this part is nice and flat. Now, if you get to this point and you are a little bit confused and you want to make sure you're stitching it in the right place, you could stitch it with a basting stitch. Open it up, make sure it lays correctly, and then open it, and then take it back to your machine and put a proper stitch in it. But I think we're pretty confident right now. So now we're just aligning that V with the right edge of that tape again. Sew right to that straight pin and then take it out and then sew straight to the end. All right, so let's see if it worked. Woohoo, it's perfect. Okay, so now we just want to trim that extra fabric and have a nice seam allowance here. And we're just trimming 1/4 of an inch from that seam that we just sewed. Make sure you're cutting on the right side of the seam. You don't want to cut all your work off. That gets discarded. And open it up again. And at this point, sometimes the faux lines up pretty nicely here, but sometimes it doesn't if you're off sewing just a little bit. So a lot of times what I'm going to do is take that to my ironing board and give it a really nice press. I am going to go ahead, and this part isn't quite as necessary, but I like to just, you know, we've put so much time into everything else. We're going to go ahead and set this back up for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We still have our 1 inch tape marker on the bed of our machine. And we're just going to go ahead and stitch this last section down. I stitch over the last few stitches by, you know, maybe about 1/2 of an inch or so, just to make sure they're nice and secured and continuous. If we did this correctly, then it should fit nice and snugly. It shouldn't be any excess fabric here. So you make sure it's nice and extended all the way down. And I did not take this and press it. Normally I would, but I'm going to go ahead and stitch it down. We're going to be overly confident here, which is not always a good state to be in when you're sewing. Stitching it, pressing it would make it a lot smoother probably. Make sure it's nice and flat. And it'll also allow you to press that new seam, a nice crisp flat seam, and then that, or last joint, I mean. Now we're just stitching it in place. All right, let's take it off of our machine. Okay, we have one last step to do. Okay, look at that. It looks so good. Okay, so now, in this case, I'm going to pull my binding to the front, and we're going to stitch it down. Now, I'm going to show you right here why I added that extra 1/4 inch. So first of all, let's check our miter corners. If we flip that fabric up, let's look at the back. Oh, look at that beautiful mitered corner. And then flip it to the front. We can also miter those corners. Beautiful. Look how beautiful that is. That's gorgeous. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to actually do this off. I'll show you a few of them here, and then I'll take it off camera and do the rest, and then come back and show you how to stitch this in place. And I'm only doing this step because it's pretty quick to do on the machine. I like to finish quilts this. We're basically going to do a top stitch really close to the edge of that. But because we gave that little extra 1/4 inch or so, we can make sure that that stitch falls into the backing and not on our binding on the back of our project, which I absolutely love. So I'm going to take this to my ironing board, and from the side that we stitched the binding down on, I'm actually going to take it and press it all the way around in that direction so that it's nice and flat. Then after it's pressed, I'm going to wrap it to the front of our quilt. Remember, we stitched it to the back, and we're wrapping it to the front to stitch it in place. And then I think I'm gonna go grab my bigger Clover Wonder clips, but I'm gonna go around the whole perimeter, make sure the binding is nice and snug to the edge of that quilt sandwich, and I can feel whether or not it overlaps the seam enough to where that stitch will fall in the background and not on my binding. And I'm going to go ahead and do that. So give me 1 second. I'm going to press so this is nice and flat on the back, wrap it to the front, and put my Clover Wonder clips all around just to hold it in place so I can come back and sew it up in my machine. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so whoever let me forget about the almighty Elmer's or just a washable school glue, then we may no longer be friends. Actually, I forgot about it for just a quick second. So sometimes I do just throw my the big jumbo Wonder clips on, and they work just fine. But the beauty about using that school glue is that with just a really light application and then pressing it in place, which I've done all the way around my quilt except for this little section here, then you don't have to worry about taking clips off. You know that it's in the exact right location, and it's really, really, really effective and efficient. There's lots of wonderful uses for school glue. This doesn't have a special tip on it. My friends at Purple Daisy's Quilt, I'll put the correct website at the bottom of the video, but it's Christy Fincher and her amazing mom Sharon Chamber. They have these wonderful, really fine tips that you can just screw onto your Elmer's school glue or any kind of school glue bottles, and they give you a really fine application of glue, and it's great for if you want to glue your curves or other things. I just put a really small application, and I'll show you quickly how I do that. So once again, I did take this to my ironing board first. I press the back, so make sure it's fully extended and press it nice and flat on the back. Then I pull it to the front and make sure it's hugging that curve, that edge of the quilt top really snugly. And then I think you can see this on the camera, but I'm literally just putting a pretty light, it would help if it's open, a pretty light application of glue just inside of the seam line for the stitch that where we stitched the binding on to the front, like that. And then I'm going to sew this part last to hopefully give it a chance to sort of dry a little bit. But for all of the rest, the whole perimeter of the rest of the quilt, then I actually ran a light iron over it to sort of dry the glue and secure it nicely. So I'm just going to press this in place. It should be okay. I may throw a Wonder Clip or two back on just to make sure it stays in place until I get around to it. But normally you put the glue on just like that, run a quick iron over it, and it is good to go. I'll just throw these in just in case. But you'll see how easy it is without the glue. Now this is all sort of bonus. Like I said, once you get the bias binding stitched down on the first side, then you can finish this however you want. So if you want to do like a ladder stitch, or the other stitch that a lot of people use for bindings where you kind of take a bite out of the binding and go into the backing or whatever, you can do that. I think that this would be really lovely with that big stitch straight on top all the way around, which is a fun way to finish a binding, especially since I did the flip to the front version. So by all means, finish this however, you know, like whatever way makes you happy. Okay, now in this particular situation, you have several different options as far as feet are concerned. What we're essentially going to do to top stitch this down is we're going to sew kind of edge stitch really close to the edge. One foot that's great for edge stitching, and just about everybody has, is your zipper foot. There is a zipper foot attachment to the small AccuFeet, the narrow AccuFeet, which I don't have right now, which would be wonderful because it still has that walking foot sort of capability in it. That would be wonderful. The standard zipper foot, if you have a straight stitch only machine, then a lot of times when I'm doing a top stitch, I'm lining that side of the fabric up with one inside edge, and then the needle will fall just to the right of that or to the left, depending upon which edge you select. So you could do that. If you're pretty good at top stitching, you can probably use just about any foot. A walking foot of some sort is really nice. So in this particular case, I'm using, it's the SD little foot attachment. Let me pull it off really quick. That goes on the standard AccuFeet and AccuFeet for the Janome, and it's really a ditch quilting foot. But I'm going to use that ledge to ride right against the side of that binding, and then I'm going to move my needle over so that it falls just inside of that. So let's see how it works out. I've actually never used this particular foot on it, but I know it should work pretty effortlessly with that. So, and then when you're top stitching this binding, let's get this in place and let's move my needle over. When you're top stitching that binding, you really want to take your time with it. So this is not your pedal to the metal activity. And if you're like me, you may need to slow it down here, because if you have a heavy foot, then, you know, you want to work with yourself, kind of. Okay, so I think, let me see if my needle is moved over. Let me move it over just a few more notches and see how happy I am with it. I think that's good right there. Let's see how this works. Uh-oh, I kind of want to look at it. Oh, how gorgeous is that? And it is falling in my backing fabric. Oh, I'm excited. Okay, so I'm just taking my time with it. I have that ditch, it's a ditch quilting foot, so that little ledge in the middle is literally resting right along the edge of the binding there. And I moved my needle over so that it falls just to the right of that. So it's like catching it, but it's really close to the edge, and it's creating a beautiful stitch there. And you can speed up a little bit once you get a little bit more confident about how you handle whatever foot you choose to use for that edge stitching. Now you see how nice that is with it glued down? It's in place. I don't have to manipulate the fabric any. I just stitch because I know it's glued in the right place already. Now, and I did put glue in the corners, but it's a little bit more bulk, so I did go ahead and put a wonder clip there. But I'm going to hold this in place and stitch all the way to the corner before I turn, just to make sure everything stays in place. Okay. think we're right there in the corner, and it looks perfect. I'm so excited about this. Okay. So take your time with it. Okay, so let's look at our stitches. Look how beautiful that is. That's gorgeous. And it's nice when that stitch falls into the backing, so then you have a really gorgeous binding, and it looks really, really nice on the front as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch this all the way around. I may have to take it off to iron that last bit of glue basting down, but I think this is going to be it. Look at that beautiful, beautiful, beautiful stitch. Mitered corners, perfectly mitered on the front and the back. And you can barely even see that stitch on the front. Look how gorgeous it is. And just like that, we have our chunky binding on. I hope you learned a lot today. At the end, we threw in a little bonus with glue basting. We talked about top stitching our binding to the front of our quilt with that really close to the edge top stitch. And overall, I really hope that you learned to accept this concept that binding is definitely a design choice and that you have a lot more options than you ever thought possible. Thanks so much for joining me today. Thanks for watching. Send pictures. I love to see your work, and we'll talk soon.